Hi YouTube, Darth here. This is Yes or No, a weapon review series where I give a clear and concise answer as to what weapons you should be using in Battlefield 4. Today's weapon is a UMP-9, and I had to reach down the request list to pull this one up as I wanted to take a look at a slightly less popular weapon. It's also one of the least used in Battlefield according to BF4stats.com. Is this an underrated treasure, and should you be using the UMP-9, yes or no? No. This was an extremely easy conclusion, as the UMP-9 is probably one of the worst weapons I've had the displeasure of having to deal with on this series. It's a weapon without a purpose, at least on PC, but it's not entirely without virtue, and I'll talk about what it brings to the table now. Between the low recoil of the weapon at .26 up, .18 left, and .18 right, the moderate rate of fire and the low spread per shot increase of just .082 degrees per round, the UMP-9 is one of the most accurate PDWs in the game. It's got a certain sweet spot at the 15 to 25 meter distance that it tends to own, and it's great for consoles where recoil can be difficult to control. Don't mistake it for a long range weapon though, as it quickly falls apart at longer distances because of its damage values. At a blazing fast 1.85 seconds for the short reload and 2.5 seconds for the empty reload time, the UMP-9 has the second fastest reload in the game outside of the secondaries. Needless to say, not many enemies are going to find you without rounds in the chamber even if you forget to reload. I'd say that reload benefit would come in handy, but surviving long enough with the UMP-9 in your hands to enjoy this benefit is actually a feat in and of itself. On the plus side, you'll rarely run out of ammo. Let's talk about why. Let me tell you all about the DPS holocaust that the UMP-9 provides. It's absolutely terrible. The UMP-9 has some of the lowest DPS in the game. Even at its best, it will drop a target in 345 milliseconds. This already puts it at a disadvantage against most of the automatics in the game. Once it starts dropping off at 20 meters, it quickly gets even worse. By the time it hits its full drop off at 40 meters, it gives players more than a half second to react and get out of the way, even if every bullet lands. The UMP-9 pretty much loses to everything at every range. At a very slow 420 meters per second, the UMP-9 has to be led to very nearly every moving target. It's just slow enough to render it completely useless at long range, and it becomes a liability at close range because of how bullet travel time is calculated heads up. Generally that means that in the best cases you'll trade in close range, and the low DPS means that you'll mostly lose. And it's really a shame that this stat is so bad because it's a mismatch for the accuracy of the weapon. Even the PP2000 fires at nearly 490. Those are really the two standout bad things about the UMP-9. If it weren't for the magnitude of the low DPS problem and long-range velocity problems, the UMP-9 would probably be a much better weapon. Doing some research, it looks like the UMP-9 used to have a much higher up-close DPS at 25 damage per bullet, which would be outstanding for a weapon. However, now that the maximum is only 22.5, it's well behind nearly every other PDW and automatic in the game. The UMP-9 doesn't beat assault rifles, it doesn't beat carbines, and it definitely doesn't beat most other PDWs. It's bad against everything at every range. And that's really the problem for the UMP-9, it has no role worth considering. It's a PDW with no discernible purpose other than to have easily managed recoil. The only time it becomes a contender is if you land every shot as a headshot. Even if you manage to land 2 headshots in a row, it's still a 3-shot minimum. Normally I might say that its accuracy could make up for a lack of damage, but because the bullet velocity is also very weak, it can't make up for the lack of damaging power at any range. Essentially every target has between a third and a half second or more to get out of the way when the UMP-9's marshmallows come their way. At close range, where PDWs typically do well, it stands out in a way that is not optimal or even good. Even the PDW-R has a role despite its out-of-place damage model. The UMP-9 is like having a shotgun that is terrible at close quarters. It's about as useful as a poopy-flavored lollipop. The UMP-9 is, like last week's SAR-21, a very easy weapon to control. The recoil is going to be very predictable with .26 up, .18 left, and .18 right. The first shot recoil multiplier is a very mild 1.8 times, providing a very manageable initial hiccup. Overall, this is going to take the weapon up, and the spread and deviation are going to take over to balloon slightly. To counter the recoil, you'll want to pull very simply straight down. Now, that's not good enough as the spread does eventually take over on longer bursts. And unfortunately, you're going to have to lay down some really long bursts with the UMP-9, especially the further away the target gets. The bullets to kill start at 5 and go up to 8. That's assuming every bullet lands. So get used to squeezing a good number of rounds off with this weapon. So how do you go about making do with what is a very underpowered weapon? Well, a lot of it is going to have to do with how you want to make up for its shortcomings. There are attachments that I'll talk about later that can help you deal with some of this weapon's problems. The two relatively successful means I found to make this weapon work were 1. Let others go first, and 2. Know that the enemy is going to come looking for you. On the first point, there is nothing you can do short of becoming a headshot ace that is going to make the UMP-9 a wonder weapon in close quarters. Even being careful to hipfire the UMP-9 is only going to buy you enough time to earn some parity with the close range blasters, and you'll still lose to the players who don't fail to pull on you first. So I found it slightly more effective to team up with a buddy or two or a whole other squad and let them take point while I stick back a bit. You won't have to shoot first, but you'll be able to bring that accuracy to bear while the enemies are worried about friendlies that are up in their face. The problem is you can't be too far back, as the UMP-9 is pretty useless at range. The second part of my tactics for the UMP-9 is the inevitable chase mentality of other players. On normal, you're going to be on their minimap for at least a full third of a second. That's more than enough time for enemies to notice you and find you, and the UMP-9 does not have the ability to deal with enemies up close. That's why it's important to run with something that is going to give them a harsh lesson about chasing, either the G18 or the Shorty. Either of these weapons are fantastic in close quarters and can make up for the shortcomings of the UMP. Just don't let them become your primary. Now, at long range, you're going to need to bring your favorite rocket artillery. Let's face it, even with some of the better PDWs, you're going to have a hard time picking off targets beyond 40 meters. The UMP-9, being possibly the worst PDW, is hopelessly outclassed at long range. It's better to just strap on a small and let the explosive charge do the work at a distance. Now let's talk about what to slap on the UMP-9. I honestly wasn't very surprised by the two most popular setups I saw, and they're about as good as you can do with the weapon. Again, doing my usual research, I matched up BF4stats.com with Battlelog to find out the most popular setups. Since they happen to be my own, I'll launch into what I was using now. For the site, I ended up preferring the Holo 1X. While I think it's totally possible to use a red dot on the UMP-9, the Holo 1X seemed to work the best for encouraging me to play the UMP-9 at its best ranges, just out from CQB and touching on mid-range. I also preferred this sight because it subconsciously encouraged me to go for more headshots, which is pretty much a requirement of the UMP-9, especially if the enemy knows where you are and can draw their weapon on you. Now for the accessory, I ended up using the laser sight. Honestly, the UMP-9 needs all the close quarters help it can get, and the laser gives it a bit more hip fire for when you're caught in a CQB situation without your G18 or Shorty. As always, turn it off when you're not using it so that you can reduce your risk of exposure. As with most weapons, here's where things take a turn. There are two perfectly legitimate choices for the barrel, and I'll go over both. My first choice would be the heavy barrel. If the enemy is particularly inattentive to the minimap, this barrel is going to give you the best performance for your UMP-9 and really dial in that accuracy. It's not a difficult weapon to control, and you get a huge upfront bonus from the heavy barrel to your initial spread. Now if you're suffering because enemies are constantly finding you, you'll want to consider using the silencer. The bullet velocity on the UMP-9 is already nothing special at 420 meters per second, and the silencer only reduces that to 310 meters per second. Slow for sure, but not a huge reduction overall. The benefits of the silencer on the UMP-9 become pretty apparent, as getting longer kill streaks is far more likely when the half second it takes you to kill anybody doesn't draw more attention. Finally, for the underbarrel, I went with the potato grip. You may also use the stubby, as they are the same grip. I used the potato because it seemed appropriate for this potato of a weapon. In concert with the heavy barrel, the potato serves to decrease the spread of the weapon on its very long bursts, and even with the silencer attached, still confers a pretty nice benefit. I also tried both the folding grip and vertical grips, but they just didn't produce as good of results as the potato. Whatever attachments you run, remember that the UMP-9 will still disappoint you. There have only been a few weapons on Yes or No that I've been as thoroughly unimpressed with as the UMP-9. These really tend to be the standouts of their class of weapons that seem to be trying to define themselves with some kind of personality as opposed to actual utility. And I can't disagree that the UMP-9 has a certain personality that makes me want to use it. However, its very mediocre stats make it a definite no. Using the UMP-9 as a training wheel sort of weapon is also out of the question, as it's locked behind a long grinding achievement. So the UMP-9 just plain sucks. What weapons should you go to instead of the UMP-9? Well, if you like the look of the weapon, you should probably consider using the UMP-45, another similar PDW that has a lot better performance when you actually want it to kill an enemy. Or if you want a PDW that really sings, you should consider looking at the MX4. It shreds at close range and is generally only hampered by its long reload. That's it for this episode of Yes or No. If there's something you think I missed, or if you have a particularly different take on the UMP-9, please let me know in the comments below. If there's a weapon you'd like to see reviewed on this series, leave a comment indicating which weapon. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, YouTube.